In the darkest of nights, when shadows threaten to consume every last spark, sometimes all it takes is a single flicker of light to remind us that hope, no matter how small, can guide us through even the most overwhelming darkness. The journey had been long and the road ahead still uncertain. Jesus and his disciples had been traveling from village to village, spreading the message of the kingdom of God. They had seen miracles, blind men receiving their sight, the lame walking, and lepers cleansed. They had witnessed crowds in awe of Jesus' teachings, lives transformed, and hearts turning to faith. Yet, as the days passed, the weight of the mission began to press heavily on the disciples. Not all towns welcomed them with open arms. Some rejected them, others mocked or threatened them. They had seen the growing opposition, whispers of unrest, and rumors of dangers waiting ahead. Each disciple carried his own private burden, a mixture of doubt, fear, and uncertainty that gnawed at his heart. That evening the air was still and heavy. The disciples sat around a small fire, the crackling flames providing the only warmth in the growing chill of night. Jesus sat quietly among them, gazing into the distance, as though he could see something far beyond what was visible to their eyes. The sky above was dark, and thick clouds blotted out the stars, leaving the world in an oppressive, suffocating blackness. Peter, sitting close to the fire, stared at the flames as they flickered and danced. His heart was heavy. Though Peter was known for his boldness, for speaking and acting without hesitation, inside him there was a growing fear that he would fail when it mattered most. He remembered the day when Jesus had called him the rock upon which he would build his church, but lately, Peter had begun to doubt whether he was truly strong enough for that role. What if, in the moment of testing, he crumbled? What if his faith wavered and he let down the one he loved most? Peter wasn't the only one lost in thought. Across the fire, Thomas leaned against a tree, his arms crossed, eyes closed. He looked calm on the outside, but inside, his mind was swirling with questions he wasn't sure could ever be answered. Thomas was known as a man who sought certainty, a man who needed things to be clear, concrete. And yet, as the road ahead grew darker, the certainty he craved seemed to slip further from his grasp. Could he continue on this path without knowing what the future held? Would their mission succeed, or were they walking into an inevitable disaster? These thoughts gnawed at him, refusing to leave him in peace. John, the youngest of the disciples, sat close to Jesus, his knees drawn up to his chest. He admired Jesus deeply, more than he could ever express in words. But lately he had begun to feel inadequate, too young, too inexperienced. How could he, the youngest, carry the same responsibility as the others? He felt like a child among men, and the weight of the mission seemed so much greater than what he could bear. His heart ached with the desire to serve Jesus faithfully, but the doubt in his own abilities cast a long shadow over his soul. The other disciples too sat quietly, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The flickering firelight reflected their silent struggles. Bartholomew's quiet reserve, Andrew's quiet determination, James' inner turmoil. Even Matthew, once a tax collector hardened by the world, felt his old doubts creeping back into his heart. Each of them, in his own way, was grappling with the enormity of the task before them. Their mission, once so clear, now felt shrouded in uncertainty. The road ahead seemed dark, and they didn't know what dangers awaited them. Jesus, sensing the heaviness in the hearts of his beloved friends, stood up. His movements were gentle and deliberate, as though he was drawing their attention to something greater than the fire they were gathered around. The disciples looked up, curiosity mixing with their unease. Without speaking, Jesus gestured for them to follow. They didn't know where he was leading them, but they trusted him enough to rise from their places and walk behind him in silence. The forest beyond their small campsite was dense, the trees standing tall and close together, their branches twisting together to form a thick canopy overhead. The path they were on was narrow, and as they moved away from the fire, the darkness closed in around them. The deeper they went into the forest, the darker it became. The last traces of twilight faded from the sky, and soon, the disciples could barely see the path before them. The trees, thick and gnarled, loomed like shadowy giants on either side, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it a strange, eerie stillness. After what seemed like an eternity, Jesus stopped. The disciples halted behind him, their breaths shallow in the oppressive silence. Then, without a word, Jesus stepped off the path and disappeared into the trees. The disciples were left standing there, alone in the darkness. The silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier around them, and they exchanged nervous glances. Where had he gone? Why had he left them? The questions filled their minds, but none of them dared to speak them aloud. Minutes passed, though it felt like much longer. The darkness seemed to press in closer, and the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, made their hearts beat faster. The disciples shifted uneasily. What if Jesus didn't return? What if they were truly lost? Suddenly, a soft light appeared in the distance. Jesus emerged from the trees, holding a small lantern in his hand. Its flame was weak, flickering in the wind, but in the vast darkness, that single light seemed to shine brighter than the sun. The disciples let out a collective breath of relief as Jesus returned to them. The small lantern, though simple, filled them with a sense of comfort. Jesus held it up, allowing its glow to illuminate the path around them. The light wasn't enough to banish the darkness, but it was enough to guide their steps. Jesus smiled at them, his eyes filled with compassion and understanding. He knew their hearts. He knew the doubts and fears that weighed on them, even if they hadn't spoken them aloud. And so he began to speak. "Let me tell you a story," he said softly, his voice calm and steady in the quiet night. The disciples gathered closer, forming a circle around Jesus and the small lantern. The light cast soft shadows on their faces, creating an intimate space in the midst of the vast, dark forest. "There was once a man," Jesus began, "who lived in a small village at the foot of a great mountain. The man was well known and respected in his village. He had a family, a home, and everything he needed. But one day a terrible storm came through the village, sweeping away his home and taking the lives of those he loved. The man was left with nothing. No family, no home, no hope." The disciples listened intently, their hearts already stirred by the story. They could feel the weight of the man's sorrow, the loss that had left him so broken. In his grief, Jesus continued, "The man wandered into the wilderness, seeking escape from the pain that had overwhelmed him. The wilderness was vast, and the man wandered through it for days, unsure of where he was going or what he was looking for. The days were scorching hot, and the nights were freezing cold. The darkness of the wilderness seemed to mirror the darkness that filled his heart. He began to believe that he would never find his way out, that he was lost forever." The disciples exchanged glances. They understood the man's despair more than they cared to admit. In many ways they too felt lost, wandering through the darkness of their own doubts and fears, unsure of what lay ahead. But one night, Jesus said, his voice growing softer, as the man sat at the base of a cliff, exhausted and ready to give up, he saw something, a tiny flicker of light far off in the distance. At first he thought it was just his imagination, a trick of his mind. But the light didn't disappear. It grew brighter. And with the last bit of strength he had left, the man stood up and began to walk toward the light. The disciples' eyes were fixed on the lantern in Jesus' hand, its small flame flickering gently in the breeze. They could almost see the man in the wilderness, his weary steps guided by the faint glow in the distance. The light led the man to a small lantern hanging from the edge of the cliff. Its flame was faint, barely enough to see by, but it was enough. Enough to show him a narrow path that wound up the side of the cliff, leading out of the wilderness. Step by step, the man climbed the path, the lantern's light guiding him. And when he reached the top, he saw the first rays of dawn breaking on the horizon. Jesus smiled gently at his disciples, who were silent, their hearts moved by the simple but powerful image. The wilderness below him, which had seemed endless and terrifying in the darkness, was now bathed in the golden light of morning. The man looked out over the landscape and realized that though the wilderness had been vast, he had never truly been lost. The light had been there all along, waiting to guide him when he was ready to see it. The disciples sat in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of the story. They had each, in their own way, felt like the man in the wilderness, lost, overwhelmed, unsure of how to move forward. The darkness of doubt and fear had clouded their vision, and they had begun to lose sight of the light that had always been with them. Jesus lifted the lantern slightly, its flame glowing softly in the night air. "This lantern," he said, "is like hope. It may seem small, and the darkness around you may feel overwhelming. But hope is not about seeing the whole path ahead. It's about having just enough light to take the next step." Peter, who had been wrestling with fear and doubt, felt a stirring in his heart. He realized that he didn't need to have all the answers or be fearless in the face of danger. All he needed was the courage to take the next step, trusting that the light of hope would guide him, just as it had guided the man in the story. Thomas, who had been paralyzed by uncertainty, found comfort in the idea that he didn't need to know everything. The path didn't need to be clear from the beginning. As long as there was light, even a small light, he could keep going. John, who had questioned his own worthiness, looked at the lantern and realized that it wasn't about being perfect or strong. It was about carrying the light of hope, no matter how small, and letting it shine for others to see. Jesus looked at each of his disciples, his love for them evident in his eyes. He knew their hearts, their struggles, their doubts. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that they would not walk it alone. "Even when your hope feels small," he said, "remember that you are not alone. When your light feels weak, lean on one another. Together, your lanterns will shine brighter, and you will guide each other through the darkest nights." The disciples nodded, their hearts lifted by his words. The darkness of the forest no longer seemed as oppressive. The small lantern in Jesus' hand, though simple, was a powerful reminder that hope was always enough to guide them, even in the darkest of times. Jesus smiled at his friends, his voice soft but filled with love. "Never forget," he said, "that you carry the light of hope within you. You are the lanterns in this world, and your light, no matter how small, will guide many through their darkest nights." As the disciples sat in the soft glow of the lantern's flame, they felt a profound sense of peace wash over them. The path ahead might still be uncertain, and the darkness might still be deep, but they knew now that the light of hope would always guide them. Together they would carry that light, illuminating the way for one another and for the world. And with that, they rose, their hearts lighter, and walked back through the forest with Jesus, the lantern lighting their path, step by step. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.